I'm here a week now, waiting for a mission, getting softer. Every minute I stay in this room, I get weaker. And every minute Charlie squats in the bush, he gets stronger. Each time I looked around, the walls moved in a little tighter.
Today's video may be deemed by a few as being a little bit controversial. Although it's not my intention to offend anyone. What we're going to look at is what I would call the environmental trichotomy. And I certainly hope anyone watching this isn't offended, because that's not my intention. But if you happen to be offended, well, I think that might say a little bit more about you than it does me. Let me explain myself. The reason this video is controversial is because it is an opinion, it's a conclusion that I have came to over the last few months. And it's an opinion that I didn't have when I started this channel a couple of years ago. But the environmental trichotomy, what is it? When I speak of it, I do not mean the actual environment around us necessarily. What I mean is, I don't mean desert, temperate forest, or mountains. What I'm looking at is what I would call living arrangements. And what I've done over the last 2 months, I've done a sort of case study, which I wouldn't say it's a case study, it's just me talking to a variety of people who have came to our worldview that are racially aware. I've asked several different people, and the results, I have to say, are kind of shocking, in my opinion. And like I said, I wouldn't have expected this 2 years ago when I started this channel. The environmental trichotomy is looking at whether a person was raised, or whether they live in, basically where they grew up. Were they raised in a rural setting? Were they raised in a lily-white suburb? Or were they raised in an urban setting, surrounded by the various sorts of what I would call the wildlife? You know what I mean by this. And I've been thinking a lot. And like I said, talking to people. Some of these people you will know. Some of them you won't never have heard of. Some of them are content creators on various platforms. Some of them are people that I've spoken to and hung out with in real life, met in real life. But what I found reinforces, by talking to them, what I have found is basically that extremes are cool. To be raised in one extreme, to have to survive in one extreme or the other, tends to produce the superior individual. To sum it up nicely, basically it just goes back to the old rule that whatever has the most adversity and is not broken by it is superior, is supreme. And this is what the conclusion that I've came to. Extremes are cool, and that adversity and struggle builds the superior being. And the environmental trichotomy is no exception to this. Now, I have only experienced two of what I consider 2 out of the 3 environmental trichotomies. But, like I said, I was extremely surprised. Well, not really once I started looking into this. But talking to these different people just reinforces it. Now, of course, I will add this too. There are exceptions to this. A lot of urban whites end up completely broken. It happens too in rural areas. There's problems with all 3. But there's also exceptions too. And what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to look closer at all of these situations, and I'm going to give you my thoughts. And I think what it exposes is what I would consider to possibly be a fatal flaw of American white nationalism. Now, I cannot speak, though. Of course, I cannot speak for how things are in other nations. I can't speak for how it is in Europe, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. I can't speak to that because I'm an American and I've never been overseas. I've never left the American South. Rarely leave Appalachia. But, and from what I understand, from what I've heard Europeans say, over there it's a little different. The inner cities over there are more, the population is more Native European. While you get out in the suburbs, and that's where the wildlife is. I could be wrong, but I believe this is what I've heard some other Europeans say before. I could be wrong, but as compared to how it is here in the United States, the inner city is usually where all the wildlife is, and the suburbs are where all of the whites have fled to, or just left to. But this, I believe, exposes a fatal flaw in our worldview. Sometimes I think we approach things the wrong way, or we just view it the wrong way. But anyways, I've got to show you something first for a couple of minutes. I've been wanting to make this video for quite a while. I've just been very busy, and I'm going to film it over a period of a few days. So the scenes will change. And I'm hungry. Miranda's made me some dinner. I'm starving. I'm going to go eat. But a couple of minutes here, I will show you where I was raised quickly. So what we're going to look at today, like I said, is the environmental trichotomy. We're going to look at the 2 extremes first, and then basically we're going to torch the suburbs. We're going to smoke the suburbs. Because I can't help it, over the last few months I've become of the opinion that the suburbs are probably a big reason why our people are in the condition that they are in today, currently. But first, I'm going to talk about the extreme and the one part out of the environmental trichotomy that I really don't have any experience with. And that is living in an urban environment. Now, it doesn't necessarily just mean urban, I guess you could say. What I mean by this is the demographics of the area that the people I'm going to mention were raised in, what they had to contend with on a daily basis. And I'll get over here in a second. Anyways, what was I lost my train of thought. But we're going to look at a few guys. 4 guys to be exact. And the most popular of these, in these circles, I guess you could say, is a guy by the name of Rondo. He was founder of the Rise Above movement. My friend Pat, who is also in this group, did a couple of interviews with him on his show Surviving by America, and the people that I'm going to mention in this video, I'll put links to their channels in the box below. I highly recommend you check them out. Not all of these guys, produce content, but, I'm going to mention them nonetheless. But the ones that do, links are going to be in the box below. But Rondo, he grew up in Queens, New York, I believe. I believe they call it a borough. One of the 5 boroughs. Forgive me if I'm incorrect there. I'm not up to date on the geography of New York City, but he was raised in Queens, New York, and he had to contend with the wildlife around him growing up. Grew up rough. He grew up fighting, scrapping. And his Rise Above movement was, I think, a very important thing for our people. I'm not sure where Rondo is right now. I don't believe he's in this country. I believe the last I heard he had been in Eastern Europe. The FBI has harassed him relentlessly because his philosophy and his group's mission seemed to focus on the self-improvement of young men, teaching them how to defend themselves and things. I think the reason that he has been harassed so viciously by the FBI is that his sort of movement terrifies the establishment. I mean, you teach a bunch of young white men to avoid the brainwashing, yet also have the ability to defend themselves extremely well, terrifies the establishment. So he grew up rough. He had to scrap. He had to fight. Excuse me. But he had adversity, and the other guys that I want to mention as well is my friend Pat. Link to his channel in the box below. John Flashcroft, I'll put a link to his in the box below. And my friends Swamp and Wigloff. Swamp's got a Telegram channel. I'll put a link to it in the box below. But my friend Pat, pretty much the same situation. He had to grow up around a bunch of wildlife, and he had to acquire street smarts over time. And he became racially aware, became a white racialist, you could say. Came over to this worldview. He had knowledge. And these guys, I would say this, these guys have something that I think is sorely lacking in the dissident right. I'm about so sick of that term in a way, to tell you the truth, but for the sake of brevity, it's just what I'll call it. Here in the DR, we're sorely lacking a sense of criminal knowledge. Guys like Pat, Flashcroft, Swamp, Wigloff, they have this. Flashcroft, for instance, me and him, we talked quite a bit about this probably about a month ago. And he also had to go through the same sort of adversity. He told me some wild stories. I mean, Flashcroft, he's seen some wild things when he was younger. But he made it through. All of these guys, they made it through their adversity and came out better on the other side. My friend Swamp and Wigloff, 2 guys I know in real life, I've met, hung out with. I know Wigloff, I've known him for a couple of years now, and when I first started talking to him, at that time he was living up north. He was still, I think back then he was only maybe 17 or 18, I'm not sure, but he lived in an apartment complex around a ton of wildlife, and he absolutely hated it. Said it was just something all the time. He was surrounded, living in close proximity to the wildlife, you could say. And I asked him, I was like, well, do they ever bother you much? And he's like, to be honest, not really, because I usually keep to myself. But when I actually met Wiglaf, I quickly seen why they didn't mess with him. Because Wiglaf is a physical specimen. He says he's 6'3". I think he weighs like 260. He's a physical specimen. I always tell him I think he's 6'6" because I'm short and he's just so tall. I could easily see why the wildlife chose to leave him alone. Certainly. He was just a physically imposing figure. And then there's my friend Swamp. Grew up down south. Also had to grow up around the diversity and whatnot. And I've been to his house, and he lives, unfortunately, him and his family live in a bit of a diverse area, and he told me over the years he's had confrontations with about every one of his neighbors. However, the last several years, they have left him alone. They basically just ignore each other, and the reason for this is because he was confrontational. He wasn't going to take their shit. He didn't let nobody punk him. And this is key. I've harped on this before. If you put up a fearsome front, if you show that you are capable of these things, I guarantee you most minority on white, I would say 90% of minority on white violence would evaporate. It would stop. And that's why I think the Rise Above movement was critical, and the various movements, little groups and such that it has inspired over the years. But yeah, when I came into this, I didn't have a high opinion of this, which of course it was new to me, all new to me. Over time, over the years, I've gained more knowledge, more information, and you change how you look at things sometimes. And I've changed how I look at them. The guys that grew up in this, we need these guys because they have went through adversity. And as America tends to, as it trends, it's undeniable, white erasure is a thing, Clarity plan. As America begins to resemble the Caribbean or Latin America, these people's experience in dealing with the wildlife will prove to be invaluable, in my opinion. And like I said, when I first started this channel, everybody thinks about the urban bugman, which, don't get me wrong, there are plenty of urban bugmen. There's plenty of suburban bugmen. And unfortunately, there are also rural bugmen. I've grown up around a few. Knew some when I was in school when I was younger. Total bugmen. Very sad. Very sad. But, yeah, that's just my thoughts on the first extreme, the one that I have pretty much no experience in. The second extreme that we're going to discuss is the one that I know the best, living rurally. Living rurally. I've mentioned before that I think the best way for our people forward... Shit, red light. The best way for our people forward is to try to get out to the countryside. It's more in line with our biospirit, our native European biospirit. To live closer to nature. And no, I know I was singing the praises of, the guys that had to grow up in what I would call the urban sector of the environmental trichotomy, I do not advise you to go to some inner city or some extremely diverse neighborhood and build your family. I'm not advocating for that, definitely. I still think ruralism is the way to go. But living rurally, in this video here, I showed you all the place I was raised, back home. I've made a series of videos where I go back home. This particular one is called Home Part 4, Up in the Holler. In this one, I finally show you the house that I grew up in, my house back home. I've shown my mother's side of the family, their farm, and where she was raised. My father's side of the family, their farm, where he lives. I've shown you these things. And my friend Relentless Enigma, I'll put a link to his channel as well in the box below. He made a pretty interesting observation. Because in the particular video I just mentioned, Up in the Holler, I never show my face. But in it I talked about how much I miss living back home. He said he could appreciate how real it was. He could tell how I was conflicted on being there, and I can't help it, I do get that feeling. No, I wasn't bawling or crying or anything, but I guess you could hear it in my voice somewhat. Every time I go home and I see my old place up there, I get a feeling of sadness. Now, I don't want to dwell on this, because if you've watched any of my videos, you know about my sordid past, you could say. I'm not going to dwell on that or anything, but I moved away 4 years ago to, get my shit together, get off the meth, try to, do something positive with my life. But, I do get a feeling of, just sadness, because, our families are both up there, and I just think about, what could have been. But although I know it's kind of silly to think of that, I love to go home. But when I leave, I get a feeling of sadness in a way. I long for the holler. And this is just, to put it, I believe this is just, blood and soil in possibly its most pure form. And there are problems with rural living as well. Definitely. Nothing's perfect. One of the big problems is the reason why I left. There is a ton, ever since Oxycontin came into the market, was released to the market, to the public, back in, I believe, 1996. Over the last, 26 years, my hometown village, it's not even a town, don't even have a stoplight in it, a red light. It has been ravaged by drugs, drug abuse. It's been ravaged by it. And I was just another part of it during the years of meth, as I call it. And it's just such a sort of, it's a sense of tremendous nihilism. Nihilism is promoted so heavily in American culture, it seems like. Could be said it's, this boomer mentality, this boomer mindset of, living life to the fullest, take it today, save nothing for tomorrow. Just the other day, this is kind of off topic, but ties into it. The other day I was working and I pull up to this lady's house. I'd been there before to work. And I see that she had paved her driveway. This is down in northwest Georgia. And she walks out the door, waiting for me to talk to her. And I was like, wow, you've paved your driveway. And she's like, yep, that was my grandson's inheritance. Do you like it? And I don't know if she was being sarcastic. Maybe she was just joking around. But if she really spent her grandson's inheritance on something that is kind of trivial like that, maybe it is the boomer mentality, Take it today, don't worry about tomorrow. Just a sense of nihilism, And that's what affects Appalachia so terribly. is a sense of nihilism. It's promoted in the culture, music, theater, cinema, all these things. So there are problems, and like I mentioned a second ago, there are rural bugmen. They're there. Maybe not as many of them, but it's there. And in Appalachia itself, me and my friend Pat have talked about this a few times on several podcasts and conversation. You see a lot of the, what we could call the globo-homo agenda. It's being pushed into Appalachia. Very insidiously, I would like to add. So yeah, I still think though, even despite these problems that I've listed, rural living is the way to go for our people. I still believe this. Absolutely. So I'm going to get up here to the river. This video is going to be, I'm sorry it's been long and rambling, but I'm going to get up here at the river. And we're going to discuss the final part of the environmental trichotomy, the suburb. I've had experience living in the suburbs, you could say. Although I don't know if I'd really consider it a suburb. We're 20 miles away from the city, but I mean it's a neighborhood. And basically, I've always thought this, and I confirm it is true, is if you live close enough to people to where you can't take a piss off your front porch, and they can see you, you live too close to other people. And I believe this, truly. Now, we finally get to the good part of the video. Talking about modern suburbia. In the last 2 years, I've lived in what I would call Lily White suburb. It's a good neighborhood. Thankfully, no, it's not some sort of gated community with some homeowners association. A homeowners association is one of the most faggiest things I've ever heard of in my life. I don't know why anyone would want to live in such a place where any bit of work you want to do around your house, can't have a garden, this or that, you know, just fuck that shit. Whoever thought up a homeowners association needs to be strung up, in my opinion. But yeah, the reason, that little audio clip at the beginning of this video was Captain Willard, Martin Sheen's character from Apocalypse Now. And in it he said every minute he spends in that room, he's getting softer, getting weaker. And every minute that Charlie kneels in the bush, crouching in the bush, he grows stronger. And this is how I felt the past year or so. I can't help it. I feel that living in this area softens. I feel like I'm getting softer, unfortunately. I'm not having to struggle to exist like I did during the years of meth. And although I have to admit the last 4 years of my life has been, it's a world of difference, much better. I can't help it. Sometimes I feel, like I said, I'm getting softer, and I think suburbia is conducive to this. Because it's all about convenience and comfort. You live close enough to everything that you don't have to drive far. And it's comfortable because you don't have to worry about certain things. It softens you. That's why I work very hard at trying to counteract this. You know, I've built raised beds in my backyard, built a fence to keep my hound out of them. Try to grow a little bit of my own food, because I still think that the best way to break the system is to try to wean ourselves from it. And I've seen this counter-signaled a lot lately. by some more prominent voices in this DR, or whatever you want to call it. But you know, suburbia is... There's a certain facade to everybody. It's all fake. It's fake and gay, for the most part. Now, you know, there are exceptions. In this neighborhood that I live in, I've met a few people that I like, met a few people that I could care less about. And there's a certain facade to a lot of the people. They're not real. They've probably never struggled for anything. They've just lived within their comfort zone their entire life. And this is an interesting observation that Miranda made probably about 6 or 7 months ago. You know, our neighborhood has a Facebook group, which neither of us are a part of. But you see people on there bicker and talk shit to each other, yet if these two people were to meet each other, walking their dogs or jogging or something, they would wave and, you know, act friendly to each other. It's all a facade. It's so fake. Fake and gay. And Miranda pointed this out to me. She's much more... She notices a lot more about social cues, you could say. Women are good at that, of course, than I do. But I believe she was 100% correct. She said that there is just a fakeness to life in the suburbs. And another time, there was a lady that came up to our house. She has some pretty nice raised bed gardens, yet she was she walked up to my backyard when I was working. She's like, "Why did you build your raised beds out of wood?" And I'm just like, "Because that's what's available, and I need to get my stuff in the ground. I've got the time. I know how to lay block. I used to do masonry work during the years of meth. I could have built them out of cinder block, but I just, to be quick about it, just build them out of wood. I know I'll have to replace it, but I know this pissed Miranda off pretty good. She's like, who the hell is this bitch? She needs to mind her own business." Miranda's got a bad temper. She is redheaded after all. But she's made some pretty good observations about how fake a lot of these people are. And like I said, there's exceptions, but overall, white suburbia is a facade. In this video here, Birth of Modernity, one of my favorite videos I've ever made. And it's the rare video where I actually wrote a script. And I believe that the modern world was begotten in 1945, the end of World War II. And what we've seen since then, in the 76, 77 years since then, is this slow degradation of the human condition. And in it, I kind of went by a decade-by-decade breakdown of what each decade brought and what it contributed. And earlier I said, what I see as possibly one of the biggest flaws of American white nationalism is this love of suburbia in the 1950s. I see it in posts online. I see people posting, you know, painted pictures of, you know, the white suburban family. They've got 2 cars in their driveway, the house, the picket fence, all these things. I think they just want to go back to the 1950s. And I mean, I can understand this in a way. Things were a lot better back then. Wasn't the rampant degeneracy, a lot of the hedonism and nihilism that came with the 1960s and the boomer generation. A lot of the you know, you look at the show Leave It to Beaver, and I enjoyed that show when I was a kid. Sure, it was in syndication. It was made in the 50s. And you know, it was a wholesome show. You know, it was funny. It didn't have to rely on, you know, dirty jokes or things like that to make people laugh. I think that kind of humor is honestly harder to pull off, to tell you the truth. I mean, I'm not above cracking a dirty joke here and there, you know, laughing at such things, but it's just wholesome, you know. And I can understand that. But if you want to know the brutal truth, the cold hard truth, the 1950s, all it was our brief reward for killing our own in World War II. That's all it was. And my boomer friend, call him my boomer pal, my friend Wes, me and him were talking the other day, and he was born in 1953. He was raised on a farm, though, a couple of counties west of me. And he was talking about how there was just a sense of optimism in the air. And I believe him. I believe he's correct in that. There was optimism, but I do believe that this optimism was a facade. All it was our fleeting reward. So I can't help but view, in a way, the 1950s with a sense of contempt. Because although there was all this optimism, all this hope, it was just our fleeting reward. And you know what came from the 1950s? The suburb. The suburbs really blew up in the 1950s. And with it blew up this sort of vapid consumerist culture that we live in to this very day. It's probably worse than ever. But back then, everyone wanted to keep up with the Joneses. That's what that phrase means. To be a consumer. Keep up and outdo your neighbors. I could give two shits about the Joneses. I hate this consumerist culture. And you know, that's a huge problem with America itself, is that we have really, I hate to say this, I don't know if we have much of a culture at all anymore. Sure, the individual regions have cultures. Rural parts of the South. I think rural areas are much better at retaining their culture. Much more than urban or suburban areas. Here in Appalachia, we still have the culture. Although, all these cultures are endangered. Greatly endangered. Through modernization, through all the tools that the system uses to shape the world that they want. We're under assault. It's undeniable. But the suburbs came from the 1950s. I think America had a decent culture. In this video here, Acquisition of the New Myth, talked a bit about Alfred Rosenberg's myth of the 20th century. And I went into further depth on my thoughts on this. The American culture was a good thing when we had manifest destiny. However, when that was achieved, which according to my friend Ronan, it was supposed to go south too, which has been South America and all this, you know, it's extremely diverse. We never achieved it, but when we reached California, the Pacific, Alaska, that was we achieved the American myth, is what I would have called it. Manifest destiny. And after that, we have just languished. And that's why we see this vapid consumerist culture, as my friend Pat likes to aptly call it. America is sadly little more than a Judeo-Freemasonic shopping mall. It's a very good observation on his part, and it's unfortunate. And you know, there's a lot of people here in the DR that like to talk about the generational divide, about the boomers, millennials, zoomers, Generation X, all these things. Well, myself, I've never been much to criticize the boomers, not as much as a lot of other people I've seen. Although I'm not excusing them for any blame for the situation, because there are a lot of boomers that were just awful. My father was a boomer. He's the best man I know. He was born near the tail end of the boomer generation. And I know a lot of other people back home who are good people that had to grow up rough during this time. But I've also met several boomers that are just completely selfish and nihilistic. But it's interesting to me that a lot of white nationalists will criticize the boomer and their mentality, yet they view the suburbs with such rose-colored lenses. What you are doing when you do this, when you idolize the 1950s, you're not looking at the ascension of our people. All you are doing is looking at the maintenance. And I mean, what you want, if you believe that I am incorrect in all these things that I'm saying, which some of you probably will, you gotta think about it. You bitch so much about the boomers, yet you just want to perpetuate the endless cycle of what created the boomer. This is what I see as a fatal flaw of white nationalism. It also ties into I think a lot of mainstream white nationalism isn't revolutionary enough. And I know this could be a controversial statement as well. I'm not necessarily talking about the hot revolution. I consider there to be two types of revolution. There's the hot revolution, which I can't speak much about on this channel. But then there's the cold revolution, and I have seen success in the cold revolution. The cold revolution is what I consider just trying to wean yourself from the system, from your dependence on the system. Get rural, get some land. If you can't, do what you can, grow a few vegetables, do like I do. Build you a few raised beds, do these things. Try to be as self-reliant as you can. Even though it's very difficult. You know, we have to keep this 1 foot in the system and 1 foot out. But we need to try to work, in my opinion, to wean ourselves. Some people would call this, you know, retreating or whatever. Some people, you know, counter-signal this. It's a disturbing trend I've noticed lately. People counter-signaling trying to live rurally, trying to promote ruralism. I've seen people say this in Telegram chats, counter-signaling it. Which you can believe in your political solution all you want. But it's never going to be achieved until things accelerate. Until things deteriorate. And even then, I don't know if it's possible. I'm not a fortune teller though. You know, you can go out there and protest. And I mean, I'll give people that do that credit, you know. Raises awareness of things, absolutely. But at the end of the day, another flaw of American white nationalism is thinking that we can emulate the civil rights movement. It's not going to fucking happen. The only reason that worked, I believe it was a psyop to destroy any genuine nationalism, both on the white side, on our racist side, and also on the black side. Look at what they did to Malcolm X. Look what they did to Marcus Garvey. I believe the Civil Rights Campaign was a psychological operation. At least a facet of it was. And it's what the elites wanted. Many of those elites were white, unfortunately. It's a harsh truth. And you know, this video's been extremely long, longer than I wanted. I'll have to get to fishing here shortly. The river is calling me. But, you know, I don't care for suburban living. Sure, it might be a decent place to raise your children, but will your children go through any adversity? And this is something that me and Miranda have talked about, is when we have children, where would we raise them? Personally, I want to go back home. The holler calls. And I want our children to grow up around their family. I want them to visit my parents, my mother and father regularly. I want them to visit her mother and stepfather regularly. I want them to learn how to use the tractor. I want them to learn how to grow things. I want them to learn how to fish, to hunt. I want them to learn self-reliance. And that's hard to achieve in a way, in a suburb. And you know, like I said, I work hard to try to keep myself from being soft. When I go fishing, I don't just pull up a lawn chair next to a lake. I hike a mile or two away. I want to get to the holes on this river that are hard to access. because a lot of people are just too lazy to do it, to be honest. It's all about comfort and convenience, and it's ruining our people. And I don't want to perpetuate that. I also, on a side note about raising children, whenever I do have children, I want them to know what their fists are for. I want to cultivate their mean streak. I want them to have a mean streak. Well, maybe I should be careful what I wish for. But what I also wish for is for them to be judicious and moral in applying this mean streak, you could say. I want them to experience adversity. You know, a lot of parents want their children to have all the things they didn't. And maybe I'm out of line saying this because I don't have children yet, and I suppose this is definitely a natural way to feel. I can understand that. But I definitely don't want my children spoiled, and I want them to go through adversity. You have to be tough on them. Anyways, is there anything else I'd like to add? I think that's about got it. As far as advocating for ruralism, I still believe it's the way to go. Although there's different positives that come from people who grew up in an urban setting around all the wildlife, compared to me, myself, who grew up, in my county that I was raised in. 99% white. But I got criminal knowledge through which y'all already know the story. I went through adversity. But in rural areas, people have a lot of skills. We could learn from each other. People that's had the urban experience that's came to our worldview, and the people like me, my friend Yonder, Desiree, the Woodlander. He's given us an excellent blueprint. I'll put a link to his channel in the box below as well. Most of you know of him, and I appreciate the shout out that he gave me in his last video. That's the only way our channels can grow, and that's why I try to shield all my friends' channels. And lastly, I was about to forget, there are exceptions, of course, to the general rule, the general theory that I have. A couple of those exceptions are my friends Dino from Goy Talk and Apollonian Germ. They both, they're borderline exceptions is what I would say. Apollonian Germ, me and him had a very interesting conversation, and he explained to me his situation growing up. He grew up in a suburb, but if you went a mile, a half a mile west or east, you ended up in a pretty rough neighborhood. And he said there was always him growing up, even though he grew up in sort of a white enclave suburb, he had to grow up around diversity in school, and he said from an early age, he learned that there are inherent differences between the races. Dino, he also had to grow up in adversity. He grew up in a suburb, but he was around the wildlife, you could say. These are two very intelligent men, definitely. I wish Goy Talk, I wish Dino still made it, but he's a very busy man, I understand. But I'll put a link to Apollonian Germ's channel as well. Most of you already know him though, probably. But anyways, this is just some food for thought. This video has been much longer than I anticipated. There was a lot I wanted to get out there. And if you stayed with me this whole time, thank you for your time. But consider these things. And if I'm wrong, if you feel that I'm wrong, leave me a comment. Thank y'all for watching. Bye-bye.